Before we begin, I need to ask you something. Have you ever stopped to wonder why millions of people around the world scramble to buy roses, chocolates, and cards on the exact same day every single year? Why February 14th? Why Valentine? And here's the really unsettling part. What if I told you that the romantic holiday you know today has connections to ancient fertility rituals, possible executions on a lonely Roman road, and a medieval poet who might have invented the entire love connection out of thin air? What if the story you've been told about Saint Valentine is actually a carefully constructed myth that's been building for over 1,700 years? Stay with me, because by the end of this investigation, you'll never look at a heart-shaped box of chocolates the same way again. This isn't just a history lesson. This is an excavation of one of humanity's most successful cultural transformations. And along the way, we're going to uncover some truths that the greeting card industry probably doesn't want you thinking about too deeply. Every year, Valentine's Day generates billions of dollars in consumer spending. It's one of the most celebrated secular holidays on the planet, transcending religious boundaries and cultural differences. Walk into any store in early February and you'll see the same imagery everywhere. Red and pink hearts, cupids with arrows, roses, chocolates, romantic cards with carefully crafted sentiments. The entire world seems to agree that February 14th is the day for love. But here's what's fascinating and more than a little bit strange. Unlike holidays with clear historical origins, Valentine's Day exists in a fog of uncertainty. We know it's named after a saint, or possibly several saints. We know it became associated with romance at some point in history, but the actual connecting thread between a Christian martyr and modern romantic love, that's where things get genuinely mysterious. Today, we're going on a deep investigation into Valentine's Day, but we're not taking the usual route. We're not going to give you a sanitized greeting card version of history. Instead, we're going to explore the uncomfortable questions, the contradictions, the myths that might not be true, and the surprising moments when this holiday could have gone in completely different directions. We're going to examine what happens when history, religion, poetry, and commerce collide to create a tradition that feels eternal, but might actually be far more recent than you think. This is the untold story of Valentine's Day, and I promise you, it's stranger and more complicated than you ever imagined. Let's start with the most basic question, the one that seems like it should have a simple answer. Who was Saint Valentine? Now, you might expect me to tell you about a heroic priest who defied Roman authorities to perform secret weddings, or a compassionate bishop who sent the first love letter signed "From your Valentine" while awaiting execution. These stories exist, and we'll get to them. But first, we need to confront an uncomfortable truth that historians have been dealing with for centuries. We don't actually know who Saint Valentine was. This isn't a small gap in knowledge. This is a fundamental uncertainty at the very heart of the holiday. In the early Christian martyrologies, which are basically lists of saints and the dates they're commemorated, February 14th is associated with not one, but multiple people named Valentine. The most commonly cited are Valentine of Rome, described as a priest, and Valentine of Terni, identified as a bishop of the city we now call Terni in Italy. Both supposedly lived in the 3rd century, both were apparently martyred for their Christian faith, both became associated with February 14th. But here's where it gets complicated. We can't definitively prove these were two separate people, or if their stories merged over time into a composite figure. Think about that for a moment. The entire global celebration of romantic love on February 14th is named after a person, or possibly multiple people, whose actual identity remains genuinely uncertain. The Catholic Church itself has acknowledged this problem. In 1969, as part of a broader revision of the church calendar, Saint Valentine's feast day was removed from the general Roman calendar. Now, before anyone panics, this doesn't mean the church declared Valentine didn't exist or that he wasn't a saint. He remains in the official martyrology, the comprehensive list of recognized saints, but the removal from the general calendar was significant. It was essentially the church saying, "We honor this saint, but we don't have enough reliable historical information about him to mandate his celebration across the universal church." So what do we actually know? We know that there were early Christian martyrs named Valentine. We have some archaeological evidence, including ancient inscriptions and references in early church documents. We know that Christians in Rome and surrounding areas commemorated martyrs named Valentine in the centuries following the supposed martyrdoms. But when it comes to the specific biographical details, when we try to paint a picture of who this person was, what he looked like, what he actually did, the historical record goes frustratingly quiet. Now, you might be thinking, okay, so the details are fuzzy, but surely the basic outline is true, right? Surely there was a Christian leader who was executed for his faith. And yes, that's almost certainly true. Early Christianity was periodically dangerous, especially in the 3rd century during the reigns of certain Roman emperors who saw the growing Christian movement as a threat to traditional Roman religion and imperial authority. Christians who refused to participate in state-sponsored religious ceremonies, who wouldn't make offerings to the emperor's genius or to the traditional gods, could face serious consequences, ranging from social ostracism to imprisonment to execution. So the framework of the story makes historical sense. A Christian leader named Valentine, living in or near Rome in the 3rd century, refusing to renounce his faith, facing martyrdom for that refusal. That's historically plausible. That fits what we know about the period. But then we get to the romantic elements, the parts of the Valentine story that everyone knows, and this is where historians start getting really uncomfortable. The secret weddings, the letter signed "From Your Valentine," the association with romantic love. These elements don't appear in the earliest sources about Saint Valentine. They show up much, much later. Here's how legends work, and this is crucial to understanding Valentine's Day. You start with a kernel of probable truth. A martyr named Valentine existed. Then, over centuries, that kernel gets coated with layers of story, like a pearl forming around a grain of sand. Each generation adds something, embellishes something, connects dots that might not actually be connected. And eventually, you end up with a narrative that feels complete and satisfying, but might be largely fictional. The most popular version of the Valentine legend goes something like this. Valentine was a priest in Rome during the reign of Emperor Claudius II, sometimes called Claudius Gothicus, who ruled from 268 to 270. The emperor, facing military challenges and needing soldiers, supposedly banned marriages for young men, believing that unmarried soldiers fought better than married ones, who might be distracted by thoughts of returning home to their families. Valentine, believing this decree was unjust and understanding the importance of marriage as a Christian sacrament, defied the emperor and continued performing wedding ceremonies in secret. When his actions were discovered, he was arrested, imprisoned, and ultimately executed. Some versions add a touching detail. While imprisoned, Valentine supposedly befriended the daughter of his jailer, and before his execution, he wrote her a letter signed "From Your Valentine," giving birth to the tradition of Valentine's cards. It's a beautiful story. It's got everything: defiance of unjust authority, secret romance, sacrifice, martyrdom, and even the origin of a beloved tradition. There's just one problem. We have no solid historical evidence that any of this actually happened. The story about Emperor Claudius banning marriage for young soldiers? Historians have searched for confirmation of this decree, and it doesn't appear in any reliable historical sources about Claudius's reign. The secret weddings? They first show up in much later accounts, centuries after Valentine's supposed death. The letter to the jailer's daughter? Same problem. These narrative elements appear to be medieval additions to the Valentine story, elaborations that made the tale more compelling and more relevant to the culture of the Middle Ages. Now, does this mean nothing in the legend is true? Not necessarily. It's entirely possible that a priest or bishop named Valentine did something that angered Roman authorities, something that might have even involved marriage or relationships in some way. But the specific story we tell, the one that gets repeated in Valentine's Day articles and children's books, is almost certainly not historical fact. It's hagiography, which is a special kind of religious biography that blends history with legend, edification, and spiritual meaning. And here's what's really interesting about hagiography. It wasn't meant to deceive anyone. Medieval Christians understood that saints' lives often contained legendary elements. These stories were told not because they were necessarily factually accurate in every detail, but because they communicated spiritual truths and moral lessons. They made saints relatable and their virtues tangible. The problem arises when modern people encounter these ancient hagiographies and assume they're historical documents in the way we understand history today. They're not. There's something else entirely. So we're left with a strange situation. Valentine's Day is named after a saint whose historical identity is uncertain, and the romantic elements of his story appear to be later inventions, which raises a really compelling question. If the connection between Saint Valentine and romantic love isn't historical, where did it come from? How did a martyred Christian's feast day transform into the world's premier celebration of romantic love? To answer that, we need to jump forward nearly 1,000 years and meet a poet who might have single-handedly invented the modern meaning of Valentine's Day. Geoffrey Chaucer is one of the towering figures of medieval English literature. He's best known for the Canterbury Tales, that sprawling collection of stories told by pilgrims on their way to the shrine of Thomas Becket. But for our purposes, Chaucer's most important work might be a much less famous poem called The Parliament of Fowls, written sometime in the 1300s, probably in the 1380s. The Parliament of Fowls is, on the surface, a dream vision poem about birds gathering to choose their mates. It draws on classical and medieval traditions of allegorical poetry, where animals represent human characteristics and behaviors. But here's the line that changed history. In the poem, Chaucer writes about these birds gathering on St. Valentine's Day, when every fowl cometh there to choose his mate. That's it. One line, one reference, but it's the earliest known connection between St. Valentine's feast day and the idea of choosing romantic partners. Now, let me be clear about how radical this was. Before Chaucer, there's no evidence that anyone associated February 14th with romantic love. St. Valentine's Day was observed as a religious feast day, commemorating a martyr, just like hundreds of other feast days throughout the church calendar. Some saints' days had particular associations. St. Christopher was invoked by travelers. St. Anthony helped you find lost objects. But St. Valentine? There was no established tradition linking him to romance or matchmaking. Chaucer appears to have created that connection, or at the very least, he's our first written evidence of it. Some scholars have spent years trying to figure out why Chaucer chose St. Valentine's Day for this romantic association. One theory suggests it might have been connected to the observation that mid-February is when birds in England start pairing off for the breeding season, though ornithologists will tell you this is actually a bit early for most British birds. Another theory proposes that Chaucer might have been writing the poem for a specific occasion, possibly the engagement or marriage of someone in the English royal court, and needed a romantic date that fell at the right time. We may never know his exact reasoning. But here's what matters. Chaucer was enormously influential. The Canterbury Tales was one of the first major works written in Middle English rather than Latin or French, and it helped establish English as a legitimate language for serious literature. When Chaucer put something in a poem, people paid attention. And apparently, people really liked this idea of St. Valentine's Day as a day for love and romance, because the connection stuck and began spreading. After Chaucer, we start seeing more and more references to Valentine's Day as a romantic occasion in English and French literature. Other poets picked up the theme. By the 1500s, there are written records of people exchanging Valentine's greetings. In 1600s England, it became fashionable for young people to draw names and give small gifts or tokens to their chosen Valentine for the day. What Chaucer started as a poetic conceit had become an actual social custom. This is one of those fascinating moments where literature directly shapes culture. A poet makes a creative choice, probably not thinking it would have lasting impact, and centuries later, that choice has become embedded in how an entire civilization marks time and celebrates relationships. It makes you wonder what other elements of our culture might trace back to some writer's random creative decision that just happened to catch on. But there's another layer to this story that we need to examine, because there's a competing theory about Valentine's Day's origins that you've probably heard, and it involves pagan Rome, fertility festivals, and the always controversial topic of whether Christian holidays were deliberately designed to replace pagan ones. We need to talk about Lupercalia. If you've spent any time reading about Valentine's Day online, you've almost certainly encountered this claim. Valentine's Day was created by the early Christian Church to replace or Christianize Lupercalia, an ancient Roman fertility festival. This theory gets repeated constantly, in articles, in videos, in casual conversation. It's presented as established fact. And like many things that everyone knows, it's probably wrong, or at least far more complicated than the simple version suggests. Let's start with what we actually know about Lupercalia. This was indeed a real ancient Roman festival celebrated annually on February 15th. The Roman calendar was filled with festivals, some grand and some relatively minor, and Lupercalia was somewhere in the middle in terms of importance. The rituals associated with Lupercalia were strange by modern standards. They involved the sacrifice of goats and a dog, priests running through the streets of Rome striking people with strips of hide from the sacrificed animals, and various purification rites that were connected to fertility and the coming of spring. The festival was associated with Lupercus, a pastoral god, and it had connections to the legendary founding of Rome and the she-wolf who supposedly nursed Romulus and Remus. Like many ancient festivals, Lupercalia blended different layers of meaning and tradition that had accumulated over centuries. By the late Roman period, when Christianity was growing in influence, Lupercalia still existed, but its original religious significance was probably fading. Some Romans likely observed it more as a civic tradition or seasonal celebration than as a genuine act of religious devotion. Now, here's where the theory comes in. Some argue that when Christianity became the dominant religion of the Roman Empire, church leaders deliberately moved or created Christian observances to coincide with pagan festivals, making it easier for newly converted populations to transition to Christian practice while maintaining familiar calendar markers. There's some truth to this idea in certain cases. Christmas's placement near the winter solstice, when Romans celebrated Saturnalia and Sol Invictus, is often cited as an example, though even that case is debated by scholars. But when it comes to Valentine's Day and Lupercalia, the evidence for deliberate replacement is surprisingly thin. First, the dates don't quite match. Lupercalia was February 15th. Valentine's Day is February 14th. Yes, they're close, but if the church were trying to replace one with the other, why not use the exact same date? Second, and more importantly, St. Valentine's feast day existed for centuries as a purely religious observance with no romantic connotations. If it was designed to replace a fertility festival, why didn't the romantic associations appear until the Middle Ages, roughly 1,000 years later? Third, we don't have any historical records of church authorities saying, we need to create a Christian alternative to Lupercalia, so let's promote St. Valentine's Day. This is significant because we do have records of early Christian leaders complaining about and condemning various pagan practices. We have sermons denouncing pagan festivals. We have church councils issuing decrees about eliminating pagan customs. But we don't have documents linking Valentine's Day to anti-Lupercalia efforts. The theory often cites Pope Gelasius I, who led the church from 492 to 496 as the one who supposedly transformed Valentine's Day into a romantic holiday to replace Lupercalia. There is a letter from Galatius criticizing Lupercalia and its continued observance by some Roman Christians, so we know he opposed the festival, but there's no evidence he promoted Valentine's Day as a romantic alternative, or that he did anything to give February 14th special romantic significance. So, where did this theory come from? It appears to be a relatively modern invention, possibly emerging in the 18th or 19th centuries as scholars looked for rational explanations for why Valentine's Day became associated with romance. The mid-February timing, the existence of an ancient fertility festival around the same time, and the general knowledge that some Christian holidays did overlap with pagan festivals created a perfect storm for speculation. Someone proposed the connection, it sounded plausible, and it got repeated until it hardened into supposed fact. What's more likely is far less dramatic. Valentine's Day's feast day was February 14th because that's when he was believed to have died, or when his remains were first honored. It existed as one feast day among many, and then, 1,000 years later, a poet happened to use that date in a poem about romantic pairing. The association caught on and spread through literary and cultural channels that had nothing to do with ancient Roman festivals. Valentine's Day and Lupercalia's proximity on the calendar is probably just coincidence, not evidence of deliberate replacement. This matters because it shows how historical narratives get created and solidified. When we want to explain why something is the way it is, we look for patterns and connections. Sometimes those connections are real and eliminating, but sometimes we're imposing patterns that don't actually exist, creating tidy explanations from messy historical processes that were far more random and contingent than we'd like to believe. So, we've established that the romantic Valentine's Day probably begins with Chaucer in the 1400s, not with ancient pagan festivals or early Christian martyrs. But how did it get from medieval poetry to the massive commercial holiday we experience today? The answer involves social customs, technological change, and the rise of consumer capitalism, and it reveals something important about how traditions evolve. After Chaucer, Valentine's Day gradually became more popular as a time for romantic gestures, especially among the upper classes in England and France. By the 1600s and 1700s, there are numerous references to people exchanging handwritten notes, small gifts, and tokens of affection on or around February 14th. These weren't elaborate commercial products. They were personal, often handmade expressions of feeling. A gentleman might write a poem for a lady. A young woman might give an embroidered handkerchief to a suitor. The real transformation begins in the 19th century with the development of mass printing technologies and the expansion of postal services. Suddenly, it became possible to produce elaborate, decorative cards in large quantities and to send them through the mail to people far away. In England and the United States, commercial Valentine's cards became extremely popular in the 1800s. Enterprising publishers created whole lines of cards featuring romantic imagery, sentimental verses, and increasingly elaborate decoration with lace, ribbons, and gilding. This was part of a broader Victorian culture that was, paradoxically, both extremely reserved about open displays of affection and deeply sentimental about romantic love. Valentine's cards allowed Victorians to express feelings that might be difficult to speak aloud. They provided a socially acceptable framework for romantic communication, complete with conventional phrases and imagery that everyone understood. The greeting card industry that emerged from this Victorian Valentine craze would eventually grow into a billion-dollar business. But Valentine's Day didn't stop with paper cards. As consumer culture developed and expanded in the 20th century, Valentine's Day became an opportunity to sell an ever wider range of products. Chocolates, specifically marketed for Valentine's Day, became huge sellers. Flowers, especially red roses, became the standard romantic gift. driven partly by genuine tradition and partly by aggressive marketing from florists. Jewelry companies began promoting Valentine's Day as an ideal time to buy diamond rings, necklaces, and other expensive gifts. Restaurants marketed Valentine's Day dinners. Hotels offered romantic packages. The holiday spread beyond English-speaking countries as globalization and American cultural influence reached further. Today, Valentine's Day is celebrated in some form in countries around the world, though the specific customs vary widely. And here's what's both remarkable and slightly disturbing about this evolution. A holiday that began as a religious commemoration of a martyred saint gained romantic associations through medieval poetry and slowly developed into a folk custom for exchanging handmade tokens has been transformed into a highly commercial, carefully marketed phenomenon that generates enormous revenue from multiple industries. Some people celebrate this as a wonderful tradition that encourages people to express love and appreciation. Others criticize it as a manufactured holiday that puts pressure on people to spend money and perform romantic gestures according to a corporate schedule rather than genuine feeling. Both perspectives have validity. Valentine's Day can be genuinely meaningful for people who use it as an opportunity to express feelings and strengthen relationships. But it's also undeniably shaped by commercial interests that benefit from creating and maintaining expectations about how Valentine's Day should be celebrated. The correct way to observe Valentine's Day, according to advertising and popular culture, involves buying specific products, eating at particular kinds of restaurants, and following scripts that might have little to do with the actual needs and preferences of real couples. What's most interesting to me is how this commercial overlay hasn't entirely erased the older, more personal traditions. Yes, people buy mass-produced cards and chocolates, but they also still write personal notes, cook special meals at home, and create handmade gifts. The holiday exists in multiple registers simultaneously, as religious observance for those who still honor Saint Valentine, as cultural tradition for those who participate in established customs, as commercial event for those focused on gift-giving, and as completely optional occasion for those who choose not to engage with it at all. This multiplicity reveals something important about how traditions function in modern societies. They're not static, handed down unchanged from the past. They're constantly being negotiated, reinterpreted, and reshaped by each generation and by the various forces, cultural and economic, that operate within society. Valentine's Day is simultaneously ancient and modern, religious and secular, sincere and commercial, meaningful and manufactured. After this entire investigation, where does that leave us? What's the real story of Valentine's Day? The truth is, there isn't one single story. There's a martyred Christian saint, or possibly several, whose identity has been lost to time. There's a medieval poet who made a creative connection between a saint's day and romantic pairing. There are centuries of people building on that connection, adding their own traditions and meanings. And there's modern commerce, amplifying and standardizing those traditions into a global phenomenon. The untold story of Valentine's Day isn't a neat narrative with a clear beginning, middle, and end. It's messy, it's contradictory, it contains elements that are historically questionable and commercially driven. But it's also deeply human. Because what Valentine's Day reveals, beneath all the myths and marketing, is a fundamental human desire to mark time with meaning, to create occasions for connection, and to find ways, however imperfect, to express feelings that are often difficult to articulate. Whether you celebrate Valentine's Day enthusiastically, ignore it completely, or fall somewhere in between, you're participating in a cultural conversation that's been going on for centuries, a conversation about how we honor love, how we balance tradition and commerce, how we navigate the gap between genuine feeling and conventional expression. And maybe that conversation, more than any chocolate or card, is the real legacy of whatever martyred Christian named Valentine started this whole strange, beautiful, complicated tradition so many centuries ago.